and gentlemen, I feel it a real privilege to speak today on behalf of the veterans group that we have established. I personally wore this cap badge for about 30 years. This cap badge is only worn by about 300 people throughout the whole of the British Army because we were pretty much one man, any job. My job, my main role, was to prepare people physically and mentally to fight war. And it was a very involved job, so we could go to any unit within the British Army to do that. And of course, I'm not only a soldier, or was a soldier, I'm also a grandfather of 7, soon to be 8, beautiful grandchildren. I'm also a father, I'm a brother, I'm an uncle, and of course those are the things that now matter to me. Because I think it's rather apt that we're here today celebrating the Victory in Europe Day, given what's going on in Gaza and Ukraine at the moment. And of course, I'm not here to glorify war on any level because I've experienced it, and there's nothing glorious about it whatsoever. I'm here to sort of pay respects to my brothers and sisters in arms, past and present, the ones that aren't here today, even from some of the most recent conflicts. Because they were the kind of people that when they went into a combat zone, the last thing you think about when you go into a combat zone is king or queen and country. The only people you're actually taking care of are the people to your left and to your right. Everything else disappears. Now, when I was asked to speak today, I thought I could speak from a technical perspective if I wanted to, but there are other speakers that have really eloquently discussed the purpose, the politics and the function around NATO, why it's destructive, and all of the other elements of why NATO ever existed. And of course, the people who create wars, from my perspective, are the ones where war never actually comes to their home doors. And so I wasn't really interested in speaking about the technicalities of it. I'm more interested in the human element of it. Because it's very easy to see something on TV and assume that's the way it is. But when you're actually immersed in an experience, it becomes real. The imagination and reality, when they meet, they equal something. And of course, a large percentage of the military personnel that join the military, they come from working class backgrounds. I grew up in a very small community, a little town called Lee in Lancashire, and that was a textiles and mining community. Now, this was a special place because this place is where the kids used to bite the dogs, and even the dogs walked around in packs. So it wasn't the smoothest of neighbourhoods. But guess what? Even on our street alone, we must have had over 40 children just in the few houses that existed in our street. And the answer to that was yes, we were Catholics, and no, we didn't have any television sets. So both my father and my brother joined the army. They joined the Royal Engineers and were sappers. I joined the military and followed in their footsteps. I enjoyed a full career going from the ranks of private or sapper right the way through to commissioned officer. And I resigned my commissioned rank in 2004 because I woke up, as far as I was concerned then. It took me a long time to get the message. But there are approximately about 3 million veterans in the UK as we speak. So that's quite a large group of people. And a lot of those people still do believe in some of the very, very old doctrines that go with war. When you take the shilling, you give your loyalty. And that loyalty can often be very, very blind. Now, I've seen war from a first-hand perspective, and I've also experienced it from different positions within my career within the British Army. And as I look at some of the footage on social media that are coming from some of these war zones, they're quite horrific. Because you're seeing the atrocities that are taking place in the Ukraine and Gaza. And this involves the total destruction of buildings, homes and communities. The loss of life and the massacre of thousands of men and women and children is just unbelievable. And I can assure you that in any war zone, that real soldiers do not involve civilian targets. And no war is right. I firmly believe that now. And as base and as horrible as it is, it's worth remembering that these people should be following a code. And that code was known as the Geneva Convention. What we're seeing currently on social media is a group of people that are getting away with literally murder. In particular, the Geneva Convention prohibits acts of murder and cruel treatment, terrorism, hostage-taking, slavery, outrages on personal dignity, collective punishments and pillage. These protections are considered fundamental guarantees for all persons, and that's a direct extract from the Geneva Convention. How much of that are we seeing at this moment in time? And how much are people getting away with some of these atrocities? And when we see soldiers posting these things, we then know that we have an old saying in the military, a fish rots from the head down. So if the heads allow it, it will happen. If the heads stop it, it will stop. And it's as simple as that with that type of chain of command. And of course, when these people call themselves leaders, I question that. Even when I look at some of the leadership that goes on with our own government, I wonder how many of them have actually attended any form of leadership development program, because I don't think they'd last very long in that type of environment. And of course, one of the basic tenets of great leadership is moral courage, having the courage to stand up and say, no, I'm not becoming an agent of destruction and indiscriminate death. But we're not seeing much of that. It may surprise you, but when soldiers go to war, when they return, a large percentage of those leave the army. And of course, when you consider that, it makes you wonder why. It's because when they're on the ground, one of the principles of soldiering is to win hearts and minds, as strange as that may seem. Because ultimately that makes the passage easier, it makes the experience easier for all. But of course, these people, as you communicate with them, you start to realise they're only simply doing what we do at home. They're trying to live their lives, feed their families, and get on with what they would consider their own daily routines. Now, I say no to NATO because it supports conflict, and it supports the conflict in Israel, even though Israel is a non-member ally, which was declared in 1987 by Ronald Reagan. I believe that NATO should be known as the North Atlantic Terrorist Organization. Because if you look at the definition of terrorism, it fits all, well, I'll read it to you. The definition of terrorism, according to the Terrorism Act 2001, the use of firearms or explosives endangering life for a political or an ideological agenda. But it stretches further than that, because equally, if we don't say no, we are also complicit in that act. Hence the reason that we have people's voices speaking out. You know, I was one of the people that was standing on the streets protesting about some of the other things that have been going on over the last 4 years, and also trained people in common law to say no. Because equally, if we condone this, we condone it by our actions. So by not saying no, we simply condone it. And of course, that's also an offence under the same convention, under the same act. This is one of the reasons that I have withheld my council tax for 4 years. And I've trained in excess of 140,000 other people to do the same. Because as far as I'm concerned, money talks. The two most powerful energies, one of the two powerful energies in this world is money. That's how they get where they want to get with minimal resistance. But I'm not for the buy-in, and never was when I was in the military, and nothing is ever likely to change around that. And we do that because we are saying no, and we are making a difference. The only lawful war is where you are defending your sovereign turf. That is the only lawfully justified war. And bearing in mind, I served in Germany, and I believe Russia was doing exactly the same, where NATO, post-Second World War, agreed that they would not encroach any further closer to Russia. And they broke that agreement. And of course, they got involved with Ukraine's leadership and function. That would challenge anyone's thinking, especially when you consider what the United States have got up to. You know, we had a bit of a joke in the military, in the British Army, because we consider ourselves to be military. We always used to say, what's the difference between an American and a piece of toast? you can make soldiers out of toast. If you've never dipped one in an egg, you probably won't get that joke. And of course, as long as people are on the attack, then we have a challenge, don't we? Because we have an organisation or a department within government called the Ministry of Defence. It's not called the Ministry of Attack, is it? It's called the Ministry of Defence. The key's in the phrase, right? And if we look at the original purpose of NATO, that was to defend us against the threat from the Warsaw Pact after the Second World War. Well, I was based in Germany, and I remember doing all the operational evaluation tests, seeing if we were ready to see if the Russians were going to come across the border, and there was always this constant threat of that happening. Thankfully, they never did. But NATO is now being challenged by Trump. And no doubt the decisions he makes will have an impact on its role within the global stage, or whether it even exists at all. But of course, it's all part of a bigger plan, I believe. And don't worry, because the warmongers won't go away. If you look at the way the EU is now shaping itself and looking to create its own force, involving the UK, stripping the UK of its sovereignty, by the way. Because the moment, now bear in mind the part of the EU that's likely to do the tasking is a number of oligarchs that are very, very wealthy people that weren't even elected in the first place, completely unelected. But of course, what people would never have been aware of is that in September 2019, 3 civil servants, Brockbank, Langley and Robbins, signed us up to the EU defence strategy under the tenure of Theresa May. This was opposed by Lord Blackheath. He tried to raise awareness around this, but it was ignored. Major General Campbell also tried to oppose it because he warned that the moment we do this, we'll lose our sovereign right. We lose the ability to decide which things we want to get involved with and which things we don't want to get involved with. And of course, now we have Keir Starmer pretending that none of that went on and that he is looking to re-establish these things with the EU. Well, I have a simple premise with my children. I say to them, retrospective honesty is not honesty. It's simply owning up. And it's always good if you do that with an apology, but I haven't heard many of those. So let's consider who benefits from war. If you serve in the military, I can guarantee you don't earn a great wage. You probably start at about 23k a year, and if you're really hard working, after about 7 or 8 years, you might achieve 38k a year, which is about the same as a labourer. Now, I'm not saying that that's a terrible wage, but I can say with the current rate of inflation and the way that labour are going, that will be worthless in about 2 years' time, and certainly won't serve you going forwards. And I reckon people are wide-eyed enough to recognise that if you were to follow the lines of money, the money trail from war, it wouldn't be long before you'd start recognising it's the arms dealers that make money. It's the insurance companies, it's the rebuilders, the ones that win the contract. And those lines always go back to the same people, BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, to name but 3. Now, these tentacles stretch across the globe, and I've looked at even local councils now. When I look at what's happening with the UK 100 and other organisations, this is a full, from a military perspective, this is a full level of chain of command reporting type system that lets the global element of it know exactly what's going on at a very local level. And that's a very difficult thing to achieve across the globe, but they seem to have managed to do that. I firmly believe that our governments are over-corporatised. I think they're controlled by corporates, and I think that they're the ones that are pulling a number of strings. Those are my thoughts. And I believe also that Ukraine is the biggest money laundering exercise that I've ever witnessed in my life. Say again? 60 million people in our country, right? We've just given, what, 50 million to a contractor that wants to turn the sun off. What would happen if we spent that 50 million around all of the people in the country? There's an idea, right? That probably will never get past the front door of Parliament. Why? Because it considers people. So the domino effect of NATO, as far as I'm concerned, is that it equals war, and it creates nothing but more war, which in turn creates cultural hatred. Division politics, as far as I'm concerned, are one of the tactics of someone that never wants you to see what they're doing while they're creating all these hypnotic smoke screens. It kills communities and destroys family harmony through mental health, and I've been at the interface of that since 2006, running programs for people coming back from war. Ask any mother, father, son, daughter what it's like to live with someone who comes back from war with post-traumatic stress disorder. The ripples are created. Of course, it also creates heroes and heroines. But there's no point being either one of those if you end up in prison. And bizarrely, the last time I checked through Viper's statistics, 13% of the prison population are veterans, and 13% of the probation population are veterans. And the majority of them are non-habitual criminals. So you have to ask, what did they do that got them into that space that they didn't do before? It might be that Tommy Atkins doesn't go to prison at all. He or she just ends up on the street, homeless. Or it could be that life gets too much. And of course, what generally happens is what happened in America, where we had anything up to 22 veterans per day committing suicide. That's a horrendous number. And remember that every individual event always has a knock-on event. Of course, NATO doesn't concern itself with such matters because when you join the military, you get given a number, don't you? When you join the military, you become a number, you become a resource. They're not interested in the family impact of what happens as a result of you becoming that number. I joined the Workers' Party. Why did I do that? Because it's uncompromising in its stance for peace and reconciliation. And I've got to be honest with you. I know why they will never debate George, because not one of them can dance around him, because he does what he says he's going to do. And of course, we are the party who oppose war on every level, but that doesn't make us pacifists. It just makes us realistic, considerate humans who are prepared to negotiate, because the costs of war far outweigh any benefits. And one death in any family, be they Muslim, Christian, Jew, Sikh, Hindu or Buddhist, or of any other colour or faith, is one too many. So I know that you will join me in this room when I say no to NATO and no to war.
Hello, and thank you for inviting me to talk about my experiences as a mum and as a peace campaigner, and also as someone who's been taken through the courts for protesting under Section 1 and 3 of the Public Order Act 2023, but more on that later because I'd like to obviously cover conscription first. I am a party member, and I've spoken on the No to NATO broadcast about conscription. I'm very opposed to it because I have 2 children of conscription age, and I very nearly ended up in conflict myself before I woke up. I was 18 and I was in the Territorial Army when we went to war in the first Gulf War back in 1990, I think she said. I wrote it down, I can't read my writing. And half of my unit disappeared overnight. And I'd grown up in the Middle East. My dad was an engineer out there, and I suddenly realised that I would be fighting against people who I had grown up with and regarded as friends, and I had been immersed in their culture. So to me, they weren't the other that we were going to war against. They were people that I knew. And that makes a big difference when you start thinking about these things. And so I went in and said that I wanted to leave the Territorial Army, and because I hadn't been served with my notices, I was able to. because I was still finishing my trade training. I did get called a few names, but that was the beginning of me starting to understand the brainwashing that goes on when you're young and you grow up into a family where this sort of thing is celebrated. I speak as a Quaker, but not for Quakers, and I joined the Quakers when I started to deepen my peace activism. I see conscription as a last resort of failed diplomacy. The only profiteers from war are the companies and corporations who manufacture and supply weapons and other warmongering paraphernalia. You know, I think there was some people made an absolute fortune in the First World War selling boots to the army. And the whole industrial military complex is owned by the capitalist class. Conscription, on the other hand, damages those who are conscripted. You would think that this would go without saying, but it's no accident that we have the soft recruitment by the British Army is targeted and in areas of high deprivation. And they specifically target white working class youth, or used to when I was part of it. They offer the promise of an escape from the hardship and poverty that people experience. They surround them with nationalistic rhetoric. The recruitment process, you know, for king and country is still a proud refrain. And they talk about noble sacrifice. But as Mick has said, that's not the experience of many war veterans who come back. I also come from, my grandfathers both were active in World War II, but they weren't in the army. So one was a mechanic in the tanks because he refused to carry a rifle. And my other grandfather, who worked on British the London Underground, he was sent to Scotland, and he was part of the Marine Bomb Disposal Unit because he was a conscientious objector as well. They didn't get away without serving. They got sent to really dangerous actual service as a punishment, really, and as an example. But luckily, he made it back. So they both did their bit in the Second World War, and they did it because they had a hope for a better future for my parents, and they were fighting the fascists. Yet today, our politicians are proudly proclaiming that conscription should become an option. And in Birmingham, where I'm from, Paulette Hamilton recently said she was calling on young people to take their head out of the sand and start the serious discussion around conscription. I utterly condemn that. And so do at least a third of 18 to 40-year-olds who, in a YouGov poll in Jan 2024, opposed conscription, and that's up from the previous poll survey that had been done in 2015. Additionally, the British Army has failed to meet its recruitment targets since 2010, acquiring a deficit of 22,350 recruits. So there's a real appetite for not joining up. And therefore, I think a conscript draft would be a very difficult ask to implement. And currently, the public would need to be convinced that it was necessary. And how would they do that? Well, maybe the mainstream media is already softening us up in the consensus. The current broadcasting of the war in Ukraine is an example, and there's plenty of research online if you wish to go down that rabbit hole. I did. I'm here. It took me a while to come out, but I'm here. But back to my point, our politicians have failed us. If we're proceeding towards conflict rather than peace work, we have already thrown the towel in. Our forebears, they fought in Europe so that we inherited a world fit for purpose. In Britain, we voted for a world-class health service to be set up, for decent pay and conditions for working-class people, and for housing fit for purpose. I rest my case. How are we doing today? With this landscape, protest against the manufacturing of arms and the fairs promoting them has become a moral imperative, in my view. Thus, I found myself chained to 2 Quakers who were locked onto the gates of Telford International Centre on the 1st of November 2023. It was cold, but it was dry. Happening inside was the one-day conference of the Specialist Defence and Security Convention, UK. They sell drones and booby-trapped anti-personnel devices and other sorts of small security, they call them security devices, I call them anti-personnel war, paraphernalia. And so rather than tanks and planes, it's the small but deadly stuff. These weapons that they sell, because they are weapons, have been tested in Gaza. We've seen it. We've seen it from the very brave press who have been sadly targeted by the Israelis, Israeli Defense, IDF. They've been filming these drones and all these things that they've been using in Gaza. This is what is actually on sale at this place in Telford. So this was the first time that they held it there in 2023. So we decided to make a stand. There we were, chained to the fence, and we hadn't been there for more than an hour before we were arrested and taken into custody, which was quite surprising because I've done this sort of thing before and we've not experienced that amount of oppression straight up. So we were held in custody for most of the day and evening, and then we were interviewed under caution, and then we were released. And then we were charged for causing serious disruption. And then we waited 18 months for it to come to court, and then we had a very good judge, and we had a very poor case from the prosecution, and we were found not guilty. In the summing up that the judge produced, there's a thinly veiled sort of, or so our barrister tells us, that there was this legal speak in there saying that this case should really not have come to court. But that is how difficult it is these days to protest in this country. And I know that they're going after environmentalists at the moment, but that's only one. They're testing out all of their new laws on people who have already been othered in the press, in the mainstream press. Soon enough, they'll come for other groups of people, and they already are. There was a letter from the UN Special Reporter on Environmental Protesters that came out after he visited our country in January 2023. It's not a long letter, and you can find it on the internet, but there's a couple of paragraphs that I feel like I should read in full. So he said, during my visit, however, I learned that in the UK, peaceful protest is being prosecuted and convicted under the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Act 2022 for the criminal offence of public nuisance, which is punishable by up to 10 years imprisonment. I was also informed that the Public Order Act 2023, that was the one they got me on, is being used to further criminalise peaceful protest. I was also alarmed to learn that in some recent cases, presiding judges have forbidden environmental defenders from explaining to the jury their motivation, This was one of the things that we were able to do because we were protesting. We were able to explain why we were there and what we were trying to oppose. Environmental defenders are now being told that they can't. Well, how long will it be before peaceful protesters will be told that they can't explain their motivations either? It's a slippery, thin end of the wedge. And the defence is reasonable excuse, so I did it because of my reasonable excuse. So they're taking that out for environmental defenders. So that was the first thing I wanted to bring to your attention. The second thing is it's good news that Liberty, I don't know whether you saw this, defeated the government appeal as court rules the anti-protest laws are unlawful. So what this has done is has ruled that Suella Braverman did not have the power to create a new law that lowered the threshold of when the police can impose conditions on protest from anything that causes serious disruption to anything deemed as causing more than minor. That's really good news for us because that means we can go and march on roads and it's more than minor because we're holding traffic up, but it's not serious disruption. The whole point of our protest laws in this country is that we can actually cause disruption because otherwise there's no point in holding a protest. So there we are. There are 18 people in jail, and some of them have been in jail since last August, and this is quite serious, for attacking the Elbit factory in Bristol at Filton, thank you. And I'd just like to highlight the fact that they've been held without trial now for more than 9 months, some of them, and they were initially arrested under the terrorism laws, anti-terrorism laws, and under those anti-terrorism laws, the police and the anti-terrorist police and probably some other government people turned over their houses completely, confiscated a lot of their electronics, but did that unlawfully because they've no longer been charged under those laws. They're being charged under just ordinary criminal law. So the police and the courts are using anti-terrorism laws egregiously to intimidate protesters who are protesting against companies that are involved in making these stuff that I was protesting against that is going out to Gaza. So suppression is happening and they are trying to create a very chilling environment. So we as protesters, myself and my friends who do it, we won't be intimidated. We will carry on. But we need to understand the environment that we are now operating in. In the last 6 years, it has become very hostile. And finally, there's a campaign called Defend Our Jurors, which was started up by a Quaker, and Trudy Warner, who stood outside the court with a billboard saying, "Jurors have the right, an absolute right, to acquit a defendant according to their conscience." It's called jury equity in the States, and there's a wonderful online information website about it all. But basically, juries of 12 randomly selected citizens have put the moral intuitions of ordinary people at the heart of the criminal justice system. Over the last few years, when juries heard evidence of why people have taken direct action to advance climate or racial justice or to stop genocide in Gaza, they have repeatedly reached not guilty verdicts. These verdicts obviously are deeply embarrassing to the government and the arms and oil industries, and lobbyists for the arms and the oil industries, such as Policy Exchange, have been working to put a stop to them. As a result, some judges have been saying that the protesters are not allowed to mention the climate or Gaza or things like that when they're explaining their reasons for why they are carrying out their protests and their civil disobedience, non-violent civil disobedience. So people have been banned from using the words climate change in court and jailed for defying that prohibition. Normally available legal defences, those that I relied on my court case, have been removed in the case for climate activists. And now, following these stitched-up trials, more and more people are being jailed for years for taking peaceful and, I would argue, proportionate action to prevent mass loss of life in the midst of our prisons crisis. There are peaceful protesters going to jail. So that's the current situation where we operate in as protesters. We are being shut down. Our rights are being limited, and our right to peaceful protest is being hemmed in left, right and centre. They're trying to stop us from taking the will of the people and expressing ourselves on the streets. So I would like to invite you to at least sign up to these websites, at least stay ahead of the legislation, and at least show your support. And I just wanted to thank you all for listening to me. Thanks.
General Zhukov behind me, hero of the siege of Leningrad, the siege of Moscow, the great victory of Stalingrad, and of course crushed the beast of Berlin in his lair on this day in 1945. Now the parade will take place tomorrow, and it would be difficult for me to send this video then, but I wanted to reach out to my comrades in the Workers' Party of Britain and their fraternal guests at the victory celebration in London. And my thanks to the Venezuelan embassy for affording the wonderful Bolivar Hall for that occasion. I can't be with you because I'm here in Moscow, but I'll be with you in spirit, as I know you were with me here in Red Square, Moscow. The significance of General Zhukov's famous words that we have liberated Europe from fascism and they will never forgive us for doing so grows more obvious and accurate by the day. They have never forgiven the Soviet Union for the fact that, if not for them, we'd all be speaking in German, except we would, of course. There would be no freedom of any kind. However restricted it now is, we had more than half a century of freedom because of the victory of Zhukov, of the Red Army, and of the Soviet leadership and people who sacrificed on an unimaginable scale for that victory in 1945. How I wish we had that wartime alliance again. How I wish that the government of the United Kingdom and the USA were here in Moscow celebrating this victory. How I wish that amity rather than enmity would be the prevailing orthodoxy in East-West relations today. Russia is a great country, and the peoples of Russia are a great collection of peoples, of enterprise, of hard work, of heart, of art, of culture, and of the highest levels of learning. We could learn a lot from them, and they could learn a lot from us. What a pity that vast gulf has opened up between our two peoples. But you, who are gathered in the Bolivar Hall right now, You want to see an end to that chasm. You want to see a bridge built between Britain and Russia so that people can cross in both directions again. We stand for that. Even if we are alone, we would stand for that, but we are not alone. It's quite clear to me that millions of people in Britain remember and cherish the great wartime alliance that we had and that was victorious. Millions of people in Britain don't want war with Russia. We have a government, we have a political class, we have a media orchestra orchestrating hate and division between our two peoples, but there are millions who don't go along with it. And I like to think that if the British government are not representing those millions here in Red Square, I will have to do the job for them.
On behalf of Ambassador Felix Plasencia Gonzalez and the Bolivarian government of Venezuela, it is my pleasure to extend our warmest greetings to the Workers' Party of Great Britain and its leaders and the colleagues of the diplomatic corps attending this remarkable event, and to all of you for coming to the Bolivar Hall, a home for the Venezuelan and the Latin American solidarity and brotherhood. It is a great honor for me to address you today and to take part in this significant gathering where we commemorate the Victory Day and the Allied triumph over fascism. Venezuela celebrates this historic occasion alongside its strategic allies. For 80 years ago, fascism was defeated and the dignity of peoples prevailed. In this spirit, allow me to begin by expressing our heartfelt congratulations to the people and government of the Russian Federation on the occasion of the 80th anniversary of the Victory Day in their great patriotic war. It is important to highlight the magnificent events being held in Moscow to commemorate such an important date. The participation of 30 heads of state and government, among them President Nicolás Maduro Moros of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. These events reaffirm the international commitment to peace and solidarity. We also extend our congratulations, of course, to the British people, the Belarusian, the Chinese, and to all of our nations that formed an alliance against fascism or contributed to this alliance which saved humanity. Dear friends, on May 1945 in Berlin, the Red Army secured the unconditional surrender of Nazism and put an end to the myth of the so-called superior race. That day, victory belonged not to one country alone, but to humanity as a whole in its stand against cruelty. On this occasion, Venezuela honors the memory of the heroes and martyrs of many countries who stood against the machinery of death and pays tribute to the victims of supremacist hatred. Their example continues to serve as a moral compass for the present, reminding us that there are struggles in which ambiguity is not an option. The peace achieved through great sacrifice laid the foundations for an international order rooted in truth, justice, and non-repetition. Today, that order is under threat from those who seek to sanitize fascism, distort history, and promote new forms of extermination. To forget is to risk repetition. To remain silent is to become complicit. Today, our peoples understand what it means to face such threats. We stand united in the struggle against imperialist aggression, hybrid warfare, illegal sanctions, and the arrogance of those who believe the world belongs to them. Our response is now clear: a multipolar, free, and sovereign world. That is today's victory, a battle we continue to fight each and every day. That is why the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela established the Anti-Fascist International for a New World in Caracas back in November 2024, with the participation of over 1,000 delegates from 76 countries. This gathering reaffirmed the commitment of free peoples to build new forms of community and resistance against fascism, colonialism, and imperialism, consolidating Caracas as an epicenter in the global struggle against oppression. One of the most significant outcomes of the International was the great festival of anti-fascist youth and students held in Caracas in January 2025, which sought to harness art, culture, science, and technology as tools in the fight against fascism. These initiatives reflect the vital role of young people and diverse nations in building a united front against fascism, promoting international solidarity and defending a multipolar world. Such efforts are especially relevant in these challenging times when revolutionary commitment and support serve as a beacon of hope and resistance, inspiring us to press forward with the assurance that we are not alone in this struggle. Brothers and sisters, this milestone marks the path toward continuous progress, unity and prosperity for our nations, and towards victory over those who continue to sow hatred and aggression to our societies. That is why the legacy of Commander Hugo Chavez continues to illuminate our path, calling on us to build a better world where self-determination and dignity of peoples are respected. From Venezuela, we extend to you our enduring gratitude and unwavering commitment, and let you know that our doors remain open for joint efforts in our shared struggle. Thank you very much.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, dear friends and colleagues, it is a privilege to be with you today at the kind invitation of the Worker Party of Britain and to address you on behalf of the Ambassador of the Russian Federation to the United Kingdom, Mr. Andrei Kelin. I would like to also warmly thank the General Secretary, Mr. Cannon, as well as previous speakers for their inspiring words and the attention to the historical veracity of the narrative on the Second World War. 80 years ago, on a day much like today, the peoples of our countries rejoiced as news broke of victory over the unspeakable scourge of Nazism. This was an epoch-defining moment, a singularity of collective thought and emotion that seemed to span the entire humanity. And while global peace did not, unfortunately, last, this fleeting moment of comprehensive triumph of good over evil was used back then by the Allied powers to establish a system of governance rooted in international law with the United Nations and its Security Council at its core. Throughout decades, this architecture has served humanity well. For the Soviet people, victory in what we call the Great Patriotic War signified the triumph of the valiant Red Army over the hitherto unstoppable military machine of the Third Reich and its satellites. For 3 long years, the Eastern Front bore the full weight of the Nazi war machine. The fate of humanity hung in the balance in fierce battles at Moscow and Stalingrad, Leningrad and Kursk, the Caucasus and Crimea. And as the Reichstag in Berlin fell, and the gates of Auschwitz and Treblinka were swung open by Soviet soldiers, the unspeakable suffering inflicted by Hitler's Wehrmacht finally came to an end. It was, as the Soviet song goes, a celebration with tears in our eyes. The war indeed, as has been noted here, came at an enormous cost for my country and for my people. It claimed the lives of 27 million Soviet citizens, mostly civilians. Millions more suffered under brutal occupation or were subjected to forced labor. Entire cities and thousands upon villages were laid waste. Now, as you can imagine, for Russians, the stories from that war are not some detached concepts from books or films. They are incredibly personal. Every Russian family has been scarred by the war. The names of besieged cities, of hard-won battles, of acclaimed generals like General Zhukov, and cunning partisans echo through the collective soul of the Russian people 80 years on. They form the sacred tapestry of indomitable will and unassailable courage that is studied and emulated by every succeeding generation of Russians, our own children included. More importantly, the war and its aftermath remains the moral compass that has directly informed my country's actions and policies since 1945. We still see the world through that prism, in many ways using the war to differentiate good from evil. This is why the Soviet Union promoted decolonization and supported newly liberated nations, while modern Russia advocates for a multipolar world based on mutual respect, sovereignty, and international law. It is also why, as a country, we fiercely resist the idea that some nations can arbitrarily claim superiority over others, suggesting that their way of life, their culture, or their language are exceptional and indispensable, while others are not, attempting to subjugate others and trying to enhance their own security at the expense of others. Now, the times have indeed changed quite dramatically. In many regrettable ways, the spirit of the wartime alliance has given way to outright confrontation. Downplaying or distorting the Red Army's key role, or even trying to erase it from the chronicles of liberation of Europe, is seen by some Western politicians to be a useful means of denying Russia a legitimate role in global governance. It gets worse. Following the slippery slope of geopolitically motivated historical revisionism, some Western governments, it seems, have conflated their own anti-Russian policies with those of the heinous regimes that their own people defeated back in 1945. And to such a degree that they have nearly begun singing from the same hymn sheets. How else can one explain that in parts of Europe today, societies have been quite purposefully desensitized to the idea of Soviet and Russian flags being forbidden from Victory Day events? How can one explain that Soviet war memorials have been forcibly removed or demolished en masse? That former SS men and ultranationalist militants adorning swastikas are invited to parliaments and openly parading, sometimes with lit torches, across city streets? How is it possible that their own governments are blocking at the UN General Assembly a draft resolution that is titled quite simply, "Combating the Glorification of Nazism"? NATO was mentioned, and indeed NATO's renewed Drang nach Osten, a campaign of proxy warfare and unprecedented pressure with the stated intention of inflicting a strategic defeat upon Russia, is a particularly provocative and dangerous throwback to the darkest days of the 20th century. On 23rd of February 1945, Winston Churchill, in his personal message to Joseph Stalin, wrote the following, and I quote, "The Red Army celebrates its 27th anniversary amid triumphs which have won the unstinted applause of their allies and have sealed the doom of German militarism. Future generations will acknowledge their debt to the Red Army as unreservedly as do we, who have lived to witness these proud achievements. I ask you, the great leader of a great army, to salute them from me today on the threshold of final victory." End of quote.
Slava Russia!
Let me say that these are indeed powerful words from a great British leader, and I would hope to be able to hear them again at some point uttered in Downing Street. Regrettably, I must say that such creeping revisionism and at times the outright falsification of history seems to go hand in hand with condoning or even praising former Nazi collaborators and their contemporary followers. The ideological whitewashing of the neo-Nazi Kiev regime, along with its repressions, its militarism, and its hideous crimes against Russians, Russian speakers, and the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine, is a prime example of this very disturbing trend. Now, this willful misrepresentation of historical truths is not only deeply offensive to the memory of the countless victims of Nazi atrocities, it is also fraught with real danger for the multilateral international institutions based on the Yalta-Potsdam consensus that the West now tries to assail. But most troublingly, what is at stake is the ethical and moral integrity of human society, indeed its very fabric. Because if hard-learned lessons of the bloodiest conflict in history are forgotten, then there is nothing to stop civilization from reenacting and reliving its horrors. We in Russia believe that it is our shared responsibility to safeguard the truth, to make sure that future generations remain aware of the true cost of victory and the extraordinary effort that went into making it possible. History should not be used as a political tool, but preserved as a foundation for learning, reflection, and ultimately reconciliation. And indeed, here at this point, I'd like to say that I am inspired by the stated commitment of the Workers' Party and its leadership to sustain this historical narrative. I was also very happy to see Mr. Galloway speaking from the Red Square just earlier. This is very brave. To support this work, I would also like to say that we will be handing out resolutions by the Federal Council of the Russian Federation on the prevention of falsification of history and the combating of glorification of Nazism. Later on, my colleague will do this. Russia cherishes the memory of all those who fell in the noble struggle against the Brown Plague. We praise veterans from our brotherly and friendly countries, including the Republic of Belarus and the People's Republic of China. We will continue to honor the British soldiers, sailors, and airmen who were once our allies. Their audacity and valor in the face of absolute evil will remain a lasting symbol of what nations can achieve when we stand together. This audience will be pleased to learn of the continuous efforts of our embassy to preserve the legacy of the Arctic convoys and to honor their participants. Just recently, new medals issued by our government were presented to many hundreds of surviving British veterans of these perilous northern maritime missions. And my ambassador just very recently laid a wreath at the Arctic Convoys Memorial in Scapa Flow. It is our deep conviction that ultimately sacrifices made by allied nations 80 years ago will not be in vain. One day, it will be these very pages of shared history filled with sacrifice and solidarity that will reopen paths towards renewed dialogue and trust between our countries. Wisdom and dignity shall by all means prevail, and as the song goes, we'll meet again with nations that were our allies in 1945 to join forces for the benefit of humanity. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, dear friends. Thank you very much for this very important and necessary meeting. Thank you for the invitation and for the opportunity to make a small speech. We really appreciate it. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Workers' Party. Thank you. Just yesterday, we celebrated Victory Day. This is a great holiday. A lot has been said. 80 years ago, with joint efforts of our countries, the Nazi threat to humanity was defeated. But Victory Day is not only a celebration of military glory and pride. It is also a day of remembrance for all those who gave their lives for future generations. The Second World War became the greatest disaster for many countries and peoples, and unfortunately in Belarus we know the price of great victory very well. Paul has already mentioned some figures. Unfortunately, they are true, but they are not full. Right now, our Chief Prosecutor Office is continuing to investigate a criminal case in connection with the genocide of the population of Belarus. So I will give you a few more figures. Unfortunately, I warn you that they are terrible figures, but they are confirmed and documented. During the war, more than 12,000 villages and towns in Belarus were destructed. Many of them were burned completely along with inhabitants, and they not revived after the war. The Nazi invaders organized 578 death camps on the territory of Belarus. The largest and the most notorious of them is Trostinets, located near the capital city of Minsk. It is estimated at least 546,000 people were killed solely in this place. Not only Belarusians, but all our other nationalities from the former USSR, including Russians, Jews, Tatars, Roma, Gypsy, and many others. More than 380,000 people were taken from Belarus into Germany as labor force, many of whom died from unbearable conditions of exploitation. These figures can be continued, but I think you understand why the Second World War became the greatest grief and the greatest disaster in history of my country. I will only know that as a direct result of the Second World War, today there are fewer people living in Belarus than it was in 1940, just before the start of the conflict. Therefore, it's our duty to remember those who died in the fight against Nazism. It's our sacred obligation. And I would like to note one more point, which is also of great importance. Victory Day is a holiday not only about the past, but also, to no lesser extent, about the future. The task of each of us here in this room, and I guess in the whole world, is to prevent the repeat of those tragic events, repeat of global conflict, repeat of their emergence of new misanthropic theories, repeat of the attempts of violent global domination. The way out is quite simple, the solution quite simple, but very difficult to achieve. We just should respect rights and interests of all other countries. We should abandon policy of sanctions, and we should never use the force as a tool to resolve disputes. Dear friends, Belarus is not a big country and definitely not the richest. Our main wealth, our main resource is our people, working people, factory workers, farmers, transport workers, miners, and many, many others. They all want to work peacefully in their country and live in harmony with all other nations. I want to assure you that ordinary working people from Belarus have always treated ordinary working people from Great Britain as their friends. This was the case during the Second World War, and it will be the case in the future. I'm absolutely sure. Thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you, Paul, for that very kind introduction, and a big thank you to the Workers' Party of Britain for the invitation to the Friends of Socialist China to speak today, and our congratulations to you on organising this meeting. And it's been inspirational to hear the speakers from the diplomatic corps, from the Russian Federation, from Belarus, and from Venezuela, and of course to hear the message from Red Square from my friend and comrade George Galloway. About 7 or 8 months ago, I was in this hall. We organised, as Friends of Socialist China, we organised here our celebrations for the 75th anniversary. 76 is coming. So that's our next meeting here. The 75th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China. And as today, one of the highlights of that event was indeed a video message from George again. And the fact that we could meet here in Bolivar Hall for the 75th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China, and we meet here again in Bolivar Hall to celebrate the 80th anniversary of the Soviet-led victory over fascism, underlines the fact that in the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, which itself has been put through such hardships and difficulties in recent years, we have wonderful, loyal comrades who stand together with people from all parts of the world in their struggles, in good times and in difficult times. So thank you to my good friend Wilfredo for that. Now, today's meeting is a timely initiative. 80 years on, the struggle against fascism, against imperialist war and genocide, for the rights of nations, and for a people's peace and a better life for working people have lost none of their poignancy or urgency. It's right that we remember this anniversary, and by that I mean that we, from a working class perspective, not just from a ruling class perspective, remember this anniversary. The war touched the lives of every family in this country, just as it did those of every family in all the countries that were swept into its maelstrom. And the victory was the result of the broadest possible unity of democratic forces worldwide. But whilst the people of every country, including the progressive and democratic forces in the Axis powers themselves, played their part, above all, this victory was inseparable from the heroic exploits, struggle, and sacrifice of the great Soviet people of all nationalities and the great Chinese people. Today, we celebrate the victorious end of the war in Europe, but the war in East Asia and the Pacific still had more than 3 months to run. And whilst it was clear that Japanese militarism would be defeated, nobody could be sure how long that would take and how many more lives it would still claim. That was the sobering reality to which people awoke after the greatly deserved revelry of the first VE Day. So being asked to speak about the war in the East on this occasion, I'll try to draw out the essential relationship between what were the two key fronts of a single united struggle, fronts that were mutually reinforcing and inseparable. And at the heart of this single struggle was the combat alliance, the friendship forged in blood between the peoples of China, Russia, and the other constituent republics of the USSR. The anti-fascist war in China, as Paul has noted, started earliest and lasted the longest. Japanese imperialism, which had first embarked on the road of aggression against China in the 19th century, occupied China's 3 northeastern provinces in 1931, creating the puppet state of Manchukuo. In 1937, Japan began an all-out war of aggression against China. In the course of 14 years, China suffered over 35 million casualties. As Xi Jinping put it in his speech marking the 70th anniversary of victory, the victory of the Chinese people's war of resistance against Japanese aggression is the first complete victory won by China in its resistance against foreign aggression in modern times. This great triumph crushed the plot of the Japanese militarists to colonize and enslave China and put an end to China's national humiliation of suffering successive defeats at the hands of foreign aggressors in modern times. He added, during the war, with huge national sacrifice, the Chinese people held their ground in the main theatre in the east of the World Anti-Fascist War, thus making a major contribution to its victory. And as then Chinese leader Hu Jintao put it 10 years previously, the war of resistance against Japanese aggression constitutes a glorious page in the history of the World Anti-Fascist War, for it broke out much earlier and lasted the longest. For a long time, we Chinese contained and pinned down the main forces of Japanese militarism in the China theatre and annihilated more than 1.5 million Japanese troops. This played a decisive role in the total defeat of the Japanese aggressors. The war of resistance lent a strategic support to battles of China's allies, assisted the strategic operations in the Europe and Pacific theatres, and restrained and disrupted the attempt of Japanese, German, and Italian fascists to coordinate their strategic positions. The victory of the war in China sets a shining example of the weak vanquishing the strong for the people all over the world and boosted the confidence and morale of the oppressed and victimized nations to carry on their liberation wars. In a word, by their heroic struggle, the Chinese people not only rose up to save their nation and civilization, by pinning down huge numbers of aggressor troops, they prevented Japan from attacking the Soviet Union, thereby ensuring that the Red Army never had to fight on 2 fronts simultaneously. Something that was absolutely crucial to expediting both the victorious conclusion to the war in Europe, but also to an overall and decisive victory over the Axis powers as a whole. In 1931, Soviet leader J.V. Stalin uttered these prophetic words: "We are 50 to 100 years behind the advanced countries. We have to close that gap in 10 years. Either we do it or we will be wiped out." In putting matters in this way, Stalin was mindful of threats to both the USSR's East and West. Since the emergence of Japan as a capitalist nation after the bourgeois revolution of the 1860s known as the Meiji Restoration, the ruling class of Japan, a country lacking in most raw materials, had cast covetous eyes at the far east of Russia and at Siberia, with its vast area, small population, but almost limitless mineral and natural wealth. In 1904, Japan launched a war against Russia, winning a stunning victory the next year. This served notice to the whole world of the emergence of Japan as a major imperialist power, whilst the shock of Russia's defeat was a major contributory factor to the Russian Revolution of 1905. Following the October Revolution, Japan joined all the imperialist powers in the war of intervention against the infant Soviet state. In 1918, Japan occupied Russia's far eastern provinces, including the port of Vladivostok and parts of Siberia. The Red Army forced their withdrawal in 1922. The Soviet Union and Japan then established diplomatic relations in 1925, but their relationship continued to be characterized by tension and suspicion. Such tensions and suspicions could only but increase after the Japanese aggression against China began in earnest in 1931. In December 1931, the Soviet Union proposed to conclude a non-aggression pact with Japan. When the Japanese side rejected the Soviet proposal, the Soviet Union attempted to sell its last remaining significant asset in Japanese-occupied Manchuria, the Chinese Eastern Railway. The negotiations on this were difficult and protracted, and the purchase agreement was not signed until March 1935. By this time, the most acute and direct tensions between the Soviet Union and Japan were starting to focus on the Mongolian People's Republic, which at that time was the Soviet Union's only true ally. From January 1935, there were frequent clashes, numbering in the hundreds, on the border between Mongolia and the so-called Manchukuo. In November 1936, having spurned Soviet offers of a non-aggression treaty, Japan and Nazi Germany, later joined by Italy, signed the so-called Anti-Comintern Pact, which in reality could only be directed against the Soviet Union. In the same year, a mutual assistance pact was concluded between the Soviet Union and Mongolia. As tensions mounted, it clearly became a matter of when, not if, a major confrontation would take place between Soviet and Japanese forces in or adjacent to Mongolia. The stakes would be high. A decisive Soviet defeat would likely prompt a full-scale Japanese invasion of the Soviet Union, with the equal likelihood that this would prompt a further attack on the Soviet Union from the West, whereas a decisive Soviet victory would contain the Japanese threat for a considerable period and allow the Soviet Union relative freedom to devote its attentions to preparations to meet an attack from the West. That major confrontation was to take place between May to September 1939. A minor dispute over border demarcation became the pretext for a Japanese attack that triggered a fierce, if undeclared, war over several months between Japan and the Soviet Union on the territory of Mongolia, before war had even been declared in Europe. Known as the Battle of Khalkhin Gol, after the river of the same name, this little-known conflict actually deserves to be known as a key battle that shaped the entire subsequent course of the Second World War. Its 85th anniversary was solemnly and grandly marked last year during President Putin's state visit to Mongolia. Just one day after the Red Army forces, commanded by Marshal Zhukov, whose later exploits we've heard about today, won a decisive victory in Mongolia, just one day later, Hitler invaded Poland. For their part, in the midst of the fighting, the Japanese leadership had been shocked to learn of the conclusion of the Soviet-German non-aggression pact on 23rd August. Japanese feelings were bitterly summarized by the newspaper Asahi Shimbun as follows: "The spirit of the Anti-Comintern Pact has been reduced to a scrap of paper, and Germany has betrayed an ally." Air clashes between the two sides continued in September, but smarting from the betrayal of their Soviet ally and the resolute blows of the Red Army, the Japanese signed a ceasefire agreement with the Soviets on 16th of September. One Western military historian has described the significance of the Battle of Khalkhin Gol as follows: "Although this engagement is little known in the West, it had profound implications on the conduct of World War II. It may be said to be the first decisive battle of World War II because it determined that the two principal Axis powers, Germany and Japan, would never geographically link up their areas of control through Russia. The defeat convinced the Imperial General Staff in Tokyo that the policy of the North Strike Group favoured by the army, which wanted to seize Siberia as far as Lake Baikal for its resources, was untenable. Instead, the South Strike Group, favoured by the Navy, which wanted to seize the resources of Southeast Asia, gained the ascendancy, leading directly to the attack on Pearl Harbor 2.5 years later, in December 1941. The Japanese would never make an offensive movement towards Russia again. However, even as he summoned 1,000 tanks and 1,200 warplanes from Soviet Far Eastern forces to join the desperate battles against the German invaders, Stalin ensured that 19 reserve divisions, 1,200 tanks and some 1,000 aircraft remained in Mongolia to confront the Japanese. For their part, having felt betrayed by their German ally, in April 1941, 2 months before the planned German attack on the Soviet Union, Japan returned the favour by concluding its own neutrality pact with the Soviet Union, when Japanese Foreign Minister Matsuoka chose to go home via Moscow following a visit to Germany. Writing about this many years later in his memoirs, With the Century, the Korean revolutionary leader Kim Il-sung observed, "Seeing that Japan was taking the initiative in proposing to maintain peaceful relations and respect each other's territorial integrity, the Soviet Union, that had been guarding against a possible pincer attack from the east and west by Japan and Germany, felt that this was a lucky chance. In those days, the Soviet Union was faced with an unprecedented threat of invasion by Nazi Germany. The large German forces massed on its western frontier might attack at any time. Japan's professed neutrality in this situation, in spite of her covetous eye on Siberia, gave the Soviet Union the respite of a possible delay in having to fight a two-front war." When Matsuoka was leaving Moscow, Stalin was said to have seen him off at the railway station. This fact eloquently spoke of the mental state of the Soviet leadership on the eve of the Soviet-German war. So how ignorant it was to think that the Soviet Union had become a friend of Japan by signing the Neutrality Pact. The more tense the situation is, the more sober must be the estimate and judgment of it. The Soviet-Japanese pact was to remain in force until 9 months before its expiry date of April 1946. At the Yalta Conference in February 1945, Stalin agreed with Churchill and Roosevelt that the Soviet Union would enter the war against Japan 90 days after the defeat of Germany. Stalin fulfilled his agreement to the letter with the launch of Operation August Storm on 8 August 1945. However, even whilst professing neutrality with Japan, and despite the huge burden of the war with Germany, it would be quite wrong to assume that the Soviet Union was indifferent to the struggle against Japanese militarism in the intervening years. In fact, the Soviet Union was deeply involved in military struggle against Japanese imperialism the whole time. As Hu Jintao said in his 2005 speech, "The victory of the war of resistance against Japanese aggression was inseparable from the sympathy and support of all the peace and justice-loving countries and peoples, international organizations, and various anti-fascist forces. The Soviet Union was the first to provide invaluable aid to the Chinese people in the war." This week, in his article for the Russian media, published just prior to his state visit to attend the Moscow celebrations, Xi Jinping noted, "In the darkest hours of the Chinese people's war of resistance against Japanese aggression, the Soviet volunteer group, which was part of the Soviet Air Force, came to Nanjing, Wuhan, and Chongqing to fight alongside the Chinese people, bravely engaging Japanese invaders in aerial combat, many sacrificing their precious lives." Moreover, in the summer of 1942, the Soviet Union took the initiative to form the International Allied Forces, together with Chinese and Korean communists and other patriots. Kim Il-sung wrote in his memoirs, "With the organization of the IAF, a great change took place in our armed struggle. It can be said that with the formation of the Allied forces as a turning point, we switched from the stage of our joint struggle with the Chinese people to the stage of extensive joint struggle, which meant an alliance of the armed forces of Korea, China, and the Soviet Union, the stage of a new common front joining the mainstream of the worldwide anti-imperialist, anti-fascist struggle. Even when the Soviet Union badly needed the strength of another single regiment or a single battalion because of the extremely difficult situation at the front, it never touched the Allied forces, but helped them so that they could make full preparations for the showdown against the Japanese imperialists." Of course, the solidarity and support in this epic conflict was never one way. It was always mutual. Many thousands of Chinese and Koreans fought in the ranks of the Red Army. One of them was Mao Anying, Chairman Mao's oldest son, who was later to give his life in the war to resist aggression and aid Korea. Anying, who had been living in the Soviet Union, petitioned Stalin to be allowed to enlist. He took part in the fighting to liberate Poland and Czechoslovakia and in the final battle for Berlin. When the Soviet Union formally entered the war against Japan, he was decorated for his role in the liberation of Northeast China. In his article for the Russian Gazette this week, Xi Jinping referred to Yan Baohang as a legendary intelligence agent of the Communist Party of China, the CPC. Yan Baohang was an intelligence agent of the CPC and the Communist International, entrusted personally by the later Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai. Based behind enemy lines in Chongqing in May 1941, this one-time student of Edinburgh University, incidentally, was able to discover the exact date, June the 22nd, of the planned German attack on the Soviet Union, thanks to his close connections with then Chinese ruler Chiang Kai-shek, and particularly with his wife, Sun Mei-ling. At that time, the Nazis were trying hard to convince Chiang to throw in his lot with the Axis powers. Yan managed to get the information to the communist base area in Yan'an by June 6, where Mao Zedong ordered it to be conveyed to Moscow, and where it then reached Stalin, enabling important preparations to be made in time. On June 30th, 8 days after the German invasion, Stalin telegraphed Yan'an to thank Yan for, quote, his accurate information that prompted us to prepare for what's to come. Naturally, as in Europe, many other forces participated in the anti-fascist war in the Asia-Pacific region, not least the communist-led guerrilla forces in Korea, Vietnam, Burma, Malaya, the Philippines, and elsewhere, as well as, of course, the United States of America and other powers. The defeat of Japanese militarism created in large measure the conditions for the successive founding of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam in 1945, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea in 1948, and the People's Republic of China in 1949, as well as expediting the collapse of the European colonial powers in Asia. It therefore, I believe, vindicates the overall assessment of the war made by J.V. Stalin in his February 1946 speech to Moscow electors, where he said as follows: "Thus, as a result of the first crisis of the capitalist system of world economy, the First World War broke out, and as a result of the second crisis, the Second World War broke out. This does not mean, of course, that the Second World War was a copy of the First. On the contrary, the Second World War differed substantially in character from the First. It must be borne in mind that before attacking the Allied countries, the major fascist states, Germany, Japan, and Italy, destroyed the last remnants of bourgeois democratic liberties at home and established there a cruel terrorist regime, trampled upon the principle of the sovereignty and free development of small countries, proclaimed as their own the policy of seizing foreign territory, and shouted from the rooftops that they were aiming at world domination and the spreading of the fascist regime all over the world. And by seizing Czechoslovakia and the central regions of China, the Axis powers showed that they were ready to carry out their threat to enslave all the freedom-loving peoples. In view of this, the Second World War against the Axis powers, unlike the First World War, assumed from the very outset the character of an anti-fascist war, a war of liberation, one of the tasks of which was to restore democratic liberties. The entry of the Soviet Union into the war against the Axis powers could only augment, and really did augment, the anti-fascist and liberating character of the Second World War. That is how it stands with the question of the origin and character of the Second World War. And with these words, I want to thank you again for the invitation, and thank you all for listening. Thank you.
Thank you to Paul, who is my political mentor, my leader, and lifelong friend. Comrades and friends, brothers and sisters, today marks an auspicious occasion when true international friendship and solidarity was needed the most and flourished the most. In humanity's long fight against fascism worldwide, we have seen this in the volunteer brigades who went to Spain to fight the Phalangists. We saw it on the streets of this very city, Jews allied with unionised workers and local residents of London who blockaded the march of the infamous black shirts of Oswald Mosley. And then we saw it in the invasion of mainland Europe and Japan to finally liberate the world from fascism. World War II was seen to be the war that ended all wars. Then we had the fall of the Berlin Wall and the Soviet Union. This marked the end, the post-war era, the post-communist era. The famous academic Francis Fukuyama identified it as the end of history itself. Now, these statements, as hyperbolic as they may seem, they captured a real spirit in the world. It was an illusion that the world was on a linear path towards liberalism and liberal democracy. But now we have seen this illusion shatter. Geopolitical rivalries have never been so stark. The culture war escalates ever higher. Our world has been plunged back into a state of conflict and war. We see trade war, we see proxy war, we see asymmetric war, but it is war nonetheless. Just as fascism was the birth child of the foolishness and short-sightedness of our financial elites, once more we see those very elites pump out war propaganda, inflate armaments budgets, and are now seriously considering conscription to fight a proxy war with the Russian Federation, with the aim of subduing and balkanizing the great country and great people of Russia. The call of international friendship and solidarity has never been more urgent. With the presence of thousands of nuclear warheads all across the world, the stakes couldn't be higher. In this context, the youth must play a leading role in restoring the conditions of international friendship and solidarity. This necessity was recognized by none other than President Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin, who, on presidential decree, initiated the World Youth Festival, with its maiden event being held in Sochi. This event was attended by over 20,000 youths participants and volunteers worldwide. A delegation from Britain that included myself. We attended and truly had the time of our lives, experiencing this historic occasion in what I think Sochi is the most beautiful area perhaps I've ever seen in the entire world, meeting some of the best and brightest youths across the world. However, upon our arrival home, the reception was far from cordial. Some of us were questioned at the airport, had phones and laptops seized. But worst of all, our names and personal information were published on a hit piece by the Daily Mail with ruinous consequences for many of us. Some of us had lost jobs over this, and some of us were targeted for harassment. Who would do such a thing? I want to name and shame him. His name is Guy Adams, who writes for the Daily Mail. He is not a journalist. He is a war propagandist and a spin doctor. Despite this ordeal that many of us went through, despite the venom that was directed our way, and despite the reprisals that we may have experienced, we knew that we were on the right side of history. We knew and we proved to the world that we were ambassadors of peace, whereas the name of Mr. Adams will live on in infamy. But I am proud to stand here as the coordinator of the National Preparatory Committee of the World Youth Festival for Britain, taking a stand with my comrades in the name of peace and international solidarity. In defiance to all threats and intimidation. I am honoured to represent a global alliance of youth across the world who are now defending the memory of the Red Army by cleaning up war memorials dedicated to the Red Army. Such war memorials that have sadly been desecrated by fascist thugs. In fact, just today, I saw some pretty nauseating footage of the reflaying process being disrupted by pro-Kiev activists. This is an insult not only to the war dead of the Red Army, but to the war dead of the British, of our own armed forces who fought side by side with our Soviet brothers and sisters. Such fascist thugs who desecrate war memorials and who are now fighting under and alongside the Nazis of the Azov Battalion have been invited by Sir Keir Starmer himself to celebrate Victory Day. I feel just that same shame that many Canadians probably felt when Prime Minister Justin Trudeau led a parliamentary applause for a Ukrainian who fought under the Galician SS. How sickening. Though it is true that our world is becoming a more dangerous place, though it is true that we have never been closer to war since the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, though it is true that Western elites have once more undergone the rehabilitation of Nazi ideology and the memory of Nazi collaborators, I also know that history moves very quickly and changes abruptly. My faith in humanity is always given a new lease of life when I see my brothers and sisters across the world uphold the torch of international friendship and solidarity. For all of you in this hall and beyond who fight for peace, victory will be ours. Moi brati I sestri, pobeda будет za nami! Please. I'm not going to ID you at the end, but if you're under 35 and want to be part of this, you're more than welcome. Well, last time we had a delegation of 5 people people from Britain. To me, that is shameful. I want a nice, big delegation to prove to the Russians, to the world, but most of all, to our own government, that the British youth stands for peace and stands for friendship with Russia and stands against fascism.
Good afternoon. I am Shanaz, National Organiser for the Workers' Party. I'm going to start by telling you my understanding of the untold political history of anti-fascism. I am a proud member of the leadership of the Workers' Party under our brave leader. I don't know whether to call George a captain or a general, but I'll tell you, he is my brother, and I'm very proud to be part of a political institution that is being led by George. I am a proud mother, grandmother, and a daughter of Kashmir. Distinguished comrades, friends from Venezuela, China, Russia, Belarus, and the nations standing against tyranny. Today we mark 80th year since the victory in Europe. A victory forged not by empires, but the blood of 27 million Soviet souls and its allies. The Red Army sacrifice buried Hitler's fascism, yet we stand as the jackboot creeps back, not in swastikas, but in NATO contracts, austerity cuts, and the lies of those that call us extremists. They dare to lecture us on democracy, the same puppeteers who arm neo-Nazis in Ukraine, starve Gaza, reward Modi's fascist regime with trade deals as it bombs Pakistan, and erases the USSR's role in defeating fascism. The Workers' Party of Britain is not here to mourn history. It is here to bury its revenants. Comrades, the BBC rewrites history. Let me illuminate the truth. Around 80 years ago today, it was the Soviet conscripts who stormed Berlin streets, and while the British generals secretly drafted Operation Thinkable, a plan to rearm the Westmans against the USSR before Reichstag's ashes were cold. But here's a smoking gun. While Churchill publicly praised Stalin, his spooks were sheltering Ukrainian fascist collaborators. The very same Bandera thugs our government arms today in Kiev. Oh, but don't mention the BBC, I'm told. You there, when did you last see a documentary about the British workers who volunteered for the international brigades? No? But you've seen hundreds of our glorious Blitz. This isn't history, it's a propaganda to justify new wars. And now they've made heroes of Shanaz, a man whose troops massacred Jews and Poles. They parade SS insignia while banning Soviet victory ribbons. And our government funds it, trains it, arms it. And they call you and I Putin's apologists for naming Bandera the butcher of Jews, but who funds Ukraine's Nazi revival. Who funds it? NATO. Who turns Libya to rubble, Syria to ash? NATO. And who profits? I ask you, who profits Lockheed Martin while British families shiver in mould? Comrades, the descendants of those who crushed Hitler now glorify its collaborators. What does that make them? So let's name the enablers. The Tories, hostile environmental architects, slashing wages, hoarding billions for NATO wars, Labour, traitors to their roots, grovelling to Raytheon, silencing critics of Israel's genocide, and Keir Starmer. His lickspittle of imperialism now rewards Modi's fascist regime as it escalates attacks on Pakistan. Trade deals drenched in Kashmiri and Pakistani blood. Starmer's Labour complicit in Hindu supremacist butchering, selling out workers for a seat at the oligarchs' table. And the Greens. They'll wag fingers at carbon while backing wars that scorch the earth. The Workers' Party knows. Climate justice needs peace, not Raytheon missiles. Anti-fascism needs socialism, not Labour's empty slogans. And yet, they scream extremism at us, the party demanding peace, the party demanding homes and bread. Why? And I'll tell you. Because we expose their game. Austerity breeds fascism, food banks, zero-hour contracts, scapegoating migrants. This is how fascism incubates. Well, I say the Workers' Party won't let you whitewash fascism. We're the only party shouting out what others whisper. That NATO's Ukrainian proxies include neo-Nazis. So let's expose the war machine. My leader would say, two cheeks of the same backside. These parties, they deregulate banks, inflate rents, then act shocked at the far-right thugs that march. We're not fooled. The Workers' Party knows fascism isn't born in rallies, it's born in boardrooms. Let's dissect this anti-fascism war in Ukraine. Funny how it's always the working class Brits dying for Lockheed Martin profits while the elites pocket the arms dividends. So John, Aves from Yorkshire, and Adam from the West Midlands, explain to me why your heating costs have doubled since 22, while the BEA system CEO got a £10 million bonus. Because this is about democracy. It's about turning Eastern Europe into a permanent arms fair. Even Trump now flip-flops to full war hawk mode. Why? Because the US Army lobby owns both parties. And Starmer, his puppet, he dances to the same masters while selling out British workers. The Workers' Party stands alone in saying no more blood for oil. No more lies about NATO's defensive wars. Yugoslavia, Libya, Syria, always the same result, and that is rubble, refugees, and resident fascism. So why is the Workers' Party under fire? Comrades, they target us because we tell the truth, and that terrifies them. They smear us as Putin's puppets for opposing NATO's expansion, extremists for supporting Palestine, and traitors for praising China's poverty eradication. Oh, but it's perfectly respectable to arm actual Nazis in Ukraine, back Modi's Hindu supremacists, and sell bombs to anyone for profit. Despite media's blockage, you can't help but look at our 6 councillors, real working class voices that are tried to be silenced. And in Rochdale, during the general election, they stole a seat through bureaucratic sabotage because they fear our growing power. They fear our leader, George Galloway. And most recently, we have members here who have first-hand witnessed it on the 1st of May. They'd rather have a reform candidate as elected through somewhat unfair placing of votes. Go on social media, you'll see the footage. Anyone but the Workers' Party candidate, I hear them. But I promise you, and I promise you this, they will not stop us. We are training our army of candidates who know the council chambers better than their Oxbridge lawyers. By next May, we will multiply our representation. But I hear whispers. But George, Paul, how can we win against this machine? The media hates us. And I think we've got some representation here. The media hates us and the system is rigged. But I ask you, when do socialists wait for permission? The top-order martyrs didn't beg for the right to unionize, they took it. And the suffragettes didn't politely request the vote, they stormed Parliament. So the next election, we will have 500 trade unions monitoring every ballot box. We'll flood every marginal with our people. They think they can stop us, let them try. So Shirley, Mark, Imran, Lucas, and all my comrades here, get ready. Because you know and I know that fascism has new faces. Let's name today's fascism. It's Sunak cutting benefits while funding Israeli bombs. It's Starmer shaking Modi's bloodstained hands. It's black and minority Britons brutalised by racist cops. Fascism isn't thugs in balaclavas. It's a mouldy flat, £2,000 in rent. It's food banks in the world's 6th richest economy. And the Workers' Party is the only one connecting the dots. This is fascism's breeding ground, when workers are disposable, when migrants are scapegoated, and when the far right grows. Our solution, class unity, workers' right, real socialism. We will together pave the road to victory. And they say we are marginal. Tell that to our packed rallies from Glasgow to Gaza, our exploding membership rolls, our digital army bypassing media blackouts. So here's our battle plan. And I haven't quite shared it with you yet, Paul, but I'm sure you'll join in me and others in this march. We will dramatically multiply our councillors by 25. We will target key Westminster seats, and we will build a 1 million-strong alternative media network. Comrades, the ghosts of Cable Street watch us today. The spirits of the international brigades stand with us. They call us extremists. We are extremists. For peace, for justice, for the working class. Because finally, remember, fascism thrives on poverty and war, and the Workers' Party fights both. From Palestine to Donetsk, from Rochdale to Beijing, our struggle is one. Join us, and together we'll be the gravediggers of this new fascism. Thank you.